There we go. So I'm not going to bother going through the objectives. Hopefully I'm going to meet them all. So some things that you need to consider when you're developing a budget is that it has to be understood, not just by you, but by anybody that picks it up later on. So it has to make sense to the reviewers, and it has to make sense to the people in post-award that are going to be helping monitor the expenditures. And it's got to comply with all of the guidance, not just the particular solicitation that you're dealing with, but general guidelines of the sponsor and any institutional requirements. You need to know if there's limitations or requirements in the guidance. For example, they may say something like senior personnel are not allowed to have salary, or somewhere buried in the proposal, oftentimes in the review area, if they provide one, will be a requirement that says something about you have to attend an annual conference with the sponsor, and they expect to see that in the budget. So you have to look through the whole solicitation to find the things that are going to impact the budget as you're building it. I mentioned before, it has to be something that you can use and has to make sense to post-award. Everyone knows that at the submission stage, your budget is your best guess at what the costs are going to be, but it can't just be something that you slap together, because it has to be reasonable and have the cost that you really need in it that you think you're going to use to do that research. The sponsor may not give you an opportunity at award to go back and revise that budget to change it to what is going to be really what you need. And there's also a good chance if they do come back and ask you to revise it, that they're not going to be giving you extra money to spend. So you need to have a good idea going into it at the submission stage what your real costs are going to be. In some instances, especially if it's a tight competition and they're down to a handful of people that they're going to award, they will look closer at the budget and the budget justification as a determining factor on the final selection. Because if you can't put together a good budget and budget justification, then what expectation do they have that you'll actually be able to do the spending in the reports the way that they want them to be done? There are different types of proposals, and that will drive sometimes the different requirements and elements that are in the budget. Some of those are federal proposals. Then from the non-federal, you might be doing work with state or local governments, foundations, or other nonprofits, industries, and international proposals. You might be on a subcontract or sub-award, or you might be competing for some type of internal award. And I will note that while ORS doesn't involve themselves in the internal awards, we will help give you a budget template and look up salary information for you in Caillou. So we'll help out a little bit on those too. So we're going to go through what's called cost principles and explain a little bit more what direct and indirect costs are, because you're going to have those on any budget you develop. Oops, I'm thinking it's the wrong way. So when you're receiving federal funds, and really pretty much any funds, there are certain federal cost principles that you're expected to know about and abide by. And they're all set in place to make sure that your spending is done in accordance with commonly acceptable requirements to make sure you're handling the funds correctly, and also to make sure that the government is only bearing its fair share of the cost. The federal government wants to make sure that they're treated on par with anyone else that you're doing business with. And I would note that a lot of agencies, like even companies and nonprofits, also go back to these federal cost principles too, because they're just sound business management practices. They have what they call Office of Management and Budget Circulars. These are a set of principles and the guidelines to help determine cost. They have been combined into the Code of Federal Regulations under Title II. So if you ever want to look at I think it's like 900 and some odd pages. It has all of the guidelines related to doing business with the federal agencies on grants and contracts and the audits of those. I mentioned the circulars and the CFR Title II because in some very old solicitations, you may still see them referred to as circulars, but they're actually all have been moved into CFR Title II. So if you come across an old solicitation and it talks about Circular A21, Circular A21 doesn't exist anymore. It's now to CFR Part 220. So this is just to help you. Most of you won't need these because all the circulars have been updated, but there are still a few old goats out there. You may hear the 2 CFR referred to as either Circular A81. That's because 8 different circulars were combined into one. So that's how come they came up with the neat number 81. You may also heard it referred to as the uniform guidance. And in fact, in most of the solicitations that you'll see out nowadays, you will either see uniform guidance referenced or you'll see the actual 2 CFR referenced. So in a budget that you're developing, usually you'll have direct cost and you'll have indirect cost. So direct cost, which is what we're going to spend the bulk of our time today on, are expenses that you can identify specifically to that particular project or work that you're going to be doing. And you can assign them with usually a high degree of accuracy. For example, you're going to go out and you're going to buy 10 surveys that are going to be used with this project versus you're going to go out and buy 50 surveys, but you're not sure how many are going to be used on this project, and you're not going to be sure how many may be kept in the office or used on a different project. So you have to be able to assign them with a high degree of accuracy. You see the red highlighted words: allocable, allowable, reasonable, and consistent treatment. These are considered the 4 key pillars of the cost principles in relationship to the federal funding. And we're going to go through each of those a little bit. So a direct cost that's allowable has to be related to the project expenses. It has to conform to the limitations that are in both the federal guidance and all the guidance that comes down the pipe. Like, does it meet the general sponsor guidelines? Does it meet the specific solicitation? Does it comply with state guidance? Does it comply with institutional policies? So is the expense that you're looking at allowable per the guidance that you've been given as you're developing your proposal and tied to this particular proposal? So an example of that would be you want to take travel to a conference related to disseminating results for this particular project. Normally that's an allowable expense. However, your guidance from the specific solicitation says that no travel is allowed. Then it would not be allowable, so you couldn't include it in the proposal. Allocability. So can this cost be easily assigned to the work that you're going to be doing for this project? It can't be something that benefits more than that one single project, even if it's by the same sponsor. And you can't buy stuff on one project and then shift it later to another one for your convenience. So for example, you've got 2 projects with NSF and you need to order a certain number of widgets, and you're going to need 10 widgets with proposal A and 5 widgets with proposal B. And you decide, oh, it's just a lot of work to order those 5 extra widgets for proposal B. I'm just going to order them all under proposal A. It won't matter because it's the same sponsor. Well, then later on, an auditor comes in and looks and says, well, they needed 5 widgets and they used 5 widgets. Where did they order the 5 widgets? And they find out that you didn't order them on the proposal that you're working on, you ordered them on another one, then you've got an audit write-up that has to be resolved. So you got to keep your buckets of spending separate. Reasonable. Would an average person looking at the expense that you're making consider that purchase reasonable, both in that it's needed and that the cost is appropriate. And the caveat to whether it's reasonable or not usually lies in the justification that you provide for that cost, both in developing your proposal and putting information in the proposal submission behind why that cost may be so high, and in your expenditures, documenting it in your receipts or the documents that are maintained to provided for that cost. You've probably heard news stories about some of these, like $10,000 hammers. Well, that might be a reasonable cost if you explain the fact that the hammer has to be made out of titanium because it's going to be used during spacewalks on the space station to do repairs. But you have to explain that. I'll go on to the next one. Consistently treated. Are the same types of expenditures treated the same regardless of the sponsor? And if you have exceptions, are they covered under institutional policy? So the federal government wants to pay the same price for doing something that you're going to charge a nonprofit or your buddy that works at another university or a company. So the government wants to pay the same price. So they don't want to see you doing lab services for them at $50 a sample and lab services for the state at $25 a sample, because then they're going to come back and they're going to say, these are the same things, but you're charging us more. So you've got to go back and give us back all the money that we've sent you. And they can sometimes go back up to 7 years and refund us the overcharges that you've made because you were charging this person less for the same work. Of note that I would make on consistently treated, this is one of the issues that we get into sometimes with audits, because when an auditor comes in, even if they're coming from a specific agency or organization, they can audit not only our records, and I mean the whole university's records related to business that we do with them, but also business that we do with anyone else, because they can look to see if we're consistently treating costs. So go to your chat screens and answer this question. Dr. Smith is approaching the last 3 months of their grant and realizes there is a large amount of unspent funds. So they decided to purchase a new spectrum analyzer to use on the grant for $45,000. This would possibly violate which of the cost principles? Cindy, you'll have to tell me how they're running so I won't leave the screen. So is it allowability, allocability, or reasonable? And it might be more than one.
It looks like we have primarily A's and maybe C's with a few B's. Somebody said all of them.
So it could be all. The allowability, you have to go back and make sure that there wasn't anything in the guidelines that prevented you from doing this. But if it wasn't originally in your budget, it might not be allowable from the perspective of the award documents. And you would probably need to get permission from your program officer to do it. Allocable, if you're going to use it on the grant, then it raises the question of why did you only need it in the last 3 months? And you could have a justification. Maybe the spectrum analyzer that you had suddenly failed and you weren't planning on replacing it, but now you suddenly have a need. Reasonable, that also any expenditures that you do in the last usually 90 days of a proposal get looked at a little bit closer, especially if you're buying equipment, because of the question of why did you only need it in the last 90 days? That's usually considered that you're buying something that you just found out you had extra funds and now you're trying to get something you can use for other projects later. And it's not uncommon, if you don't have good justifications and you haven't cleared this purchase, that you will have to pay those funds back. So would a reasonable person purchase this $45,000 item with only 3 months to use it on the grant? So that's our overview of direct cost. So then facilities and administrative costs. These are costs that you can't put a good number to. For example, how many exact dollars does it take to operate your lab or your office space? You have to take into consideration any clerical or administrative use support you get, custodial work, HR staff. Will the work that you're doing rely on any resources from libraries or other common buildings, like where test equipment is set up? Overall building maintenance and utilities cost and things like that. So to capture those costs, the university has a federally negotiated rate that gives us a percentage of how much it takes for the university to do work for each dollar of funding that they receive from the federal government. So right now, our organized research rate is 55%. So what that is saying is that for every dollar of research that we do for the government, it involves 55% cost for us in all of these things like office space, clerical staff, utilities, and things like that. And I would note that actually usually the rate negotiation, our rate is actually usually in the 60s, but the government only allows the 55%. Some sponsors and PIs refer to facilities and administrative costs, or F&A, or indirect cost, as overhead or profit or funny money or second taxes and things like that. And it's usually because they just don't understand what the F&A IDC is. It's actually real cost that the university has in doing research or sponsored projects that just isn't captured usually in the actual budget that's being developed. And we're going to go into that a lot more in the Budget Basics Part 3. At OU, your PDS will help you determine what the correct rate is and give you a budget template that's already set to calculate at that rate. If you have work that is being done off campus or that is not organized research, we have methods for you to request evaluation to get a lower rate. That's part of our negotiated scheme. So do we have any questions?